Section 10 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 6. On the 20th of August, 1640, the king set out for York on his way to Scotland. In some haste, and Inglesant accompanied, or rather preceded him, his duty being to provide apartments for the king. The king advanced no farther than North Allerton, Lord Strafford being at Darlington, and a large part of the army at Newburn upon Tyne, from whence they retreated before the Scots almost without fighting. It was at this time that Inglesant began to see more of the real state of affairs among the leaders of the royal party, and became aware of the real weakness of their position. He appears to have formed the opinion that Lord Strafford, in spite of his great qualities, had failed altogether in establishing himself on a firm and lasting footing of power, and was deficient in those qualities of a statesman that ensure success, and incapable of realizing the necessities of the times. His army, on which he relied, was disorganized and totally without devotion or enthusiasm. It melted away before the Scots, or fraternized with them at the trained bands and gentry who came into the king's standard, and to the earl, prefaced all their offers of service with petitions for the redress of grievances and the calling together a parliament. Inglesant had already formed the opinion that the archbishop, who was now left at the head of affairs in London with the privy council, and was vainly endeavouring to prevent the citizens from sending up monster petitions to the king, was even more at variance with the inevitable course of events, and more powerless to withstand them than the earl. And he appears to have written to his friend the Jesuit, for his guidance, careful explanations of his own views on these subjects. Father Hall, however, was not a man hastily to change his course. He had belonged from the beginning to that section of the popish party whose policy had been to support the High Church party rather than to oppose it, and this policy was strengthened now that the royal power itself began to be attacked. Whatever others of the popish party might think, those with whom the Jesuit acted, and the party at Rome which directed their conduct, were undeviating supporters of the king, and were convinced that all advantage which the papist might in future achieve was dependent upon him. It is not apparent what action the Jesuit was taking at this moment. Probably he was contented to watch the course of events, but this much is certain, that his efforts to induce churchmen to work with him were increased rather than diminished. While the king was at York, the Marquis of Montrose, who was in the Covenanter's army, carried on a correspondence with him, and copies of his letters were believed to be stolen from the king's pockets at night by one of the gentlemen of the bedchamber, and sent to the leader of the Scots army. Montrose retired into Scotland, and as the king was desirous of continuing a correspondence which promised so much, he decided upon sending a special messenger to the Marquis. Inglesant was fixed upon this mission, as being known by the Royalists as a confidential agent of the court, but at the same time almost entirely unknown to the opposite party. He found Montrose at Edinburgh at a time when the Marquis was endeavouring to form a party among the nobility of Scotland, in opposition to the Covenant. Inglesant was probably little more in this negotiation than an accredited letter-carrier, but a circumstance occurred in connection with his stay in Scotland, which is not without interest with reference to his future character. Among the gentlemen with whom Montrose was in connection were some of the Highland chiefs, and to one of these the Marquis sent Inglesant as a safe agent, being perfectly unknown in Scotland. This gentleman, understanding that the messenger of Montrose was coming to meet him, travelled down from the Highlands with a great retinue of servants, and sent on one of his gentlemen, with a few attendants, to meet the young Englishman on the borders of Perthshire. Inglesant had ridden from Stirling, and the night being stormy and dark, he had stopped at a gentleman's house in a lonely situation at the foot of the Badenoch hills. Here, late in the evening, his entertainers met him, and they passed the night in company. After supper, as they were sitting in front of the fire with the master of the house and several more, the conversation turned upon the faculty of second sight and the numberless instances of its certainty with which the Highland gentlemen were acquainted. While they were thus discoursing, the attention of the gentleman who had come to meet Inglesant was attracted by an old Highlander who sat in the large chimney, and he inquired whether he saw anything unusual in the Englishman that made him regard him with such attention. He said no, he saw nothing in him fatal or remarkable more than this, that he was much mistaken if that young man was not a seer himself, or at any rate would be able before many months were over to see apparitions and spirits. Inglesant thought little of this at the time, but he remembered it afterwards when an event occurred on his return to London which recalled it to his recollection. The treaty having been settled with the Scots and the writs issued for a new parliament, the king returned to London. One day in September, Inglesant received a visit from one of the servants of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who brought a message from Laud expressing a wish to see Mr. Inglesant at his dinner at Lambeth Place on any day that would suit his convenience. He went the next day by water at the proper hour, and was ushered into the great hall of the palace, where dinner was laid, and many gentlemen and clergymen standing about in the windows and round the tables, waiting the Archbishop. Inglesant's entrance was remarked at once, his dress and appearance rendering him conspicuous, and his person being well known, and occasioned some surprise. For the Archbishop had not been latterly on friendly terms with the Queen, whom he had opposed on some questions relating to Papists, to whom party, even since his being in the King's household, Inglesant was considered to belong. The servants had evidently received orders concerning him, for he was placed very high at table, and waited upon with great attention. On the Archbishop's entrance he noticed Inglesant particularly, and expressed his pleasure at seeing him there. The conversation at dinner turned entirely on the Scotch rebellion, and the failure of the Earl of Strafford to repress it, and on the King's return to London, which had not long taken place. Several gentlemen present had been with the army, and spoke of the insubordination among the officers, especially such as had been Parliament men. The elections for the new Parliament were expected shortly to take place, and many of the officers were deserting from the army, and coming up to London and other places to secure their return. The utmost dissatisfaction and insubordination prevailed over the whole country, for Laud and Strafford, after exciting the animosity of the people, had proved themselves weak, and the people began to despise as well as hate them, not perceiving that this probably proved that they were not the finished tyrants they were supposed to be. Strafford's army, raised by himself, having proved powerless against the Scots and insubordinate against its master, the popular party was encouraged to attack him, whom they hated as much as ever, though they began to fear him less. The violent excitement of the popular party against the high churchmen and against ceremonies was also a subject of conversation. The wildest rumours were prevalent as to the probable conduct of the new Parliament, but all agreed that the Lord Lieutenant and the Archbishop and probably the Lord Keeper would be impeached. After dinner the Archbishop rose from table and retired into one of the windows, at the upper end of the hall, overlooking the river, requesting Inglesant, to whom he pointed out the beauties of the view, to follow him. Having done this, he said a few words to him in a low voice, explaining his regret at the difference which had arisen between himself and the Queen, whose most faithful servant he protested he had ever been, and whom he was most desirous to please. He then went on to say that he both could and intended to inform Her Majesty of this through other channels than Mr. Inglesant, though he bespoke his good offices therein. But he wished principally to speak to him of another matter, which would require privacy, to explain fully to him. But thus far he would say that although he had always been a true servant of the Church of England, and had never entertained any thoughts inconsistent with such fidelity, yet he believed the Roman Catholics were aware that he had always behaved with great toleration to them, and always entertained a great respect for their religion, refusing to allow it to be abused or described as Antichrist in the English pulpits. That it was notorious that he had excited the enmity of the popular party by this conduct, and that whatever he might suffer under the new Parliament would be in consequence of it. He was aware that Mr. Inglesant was in the confidence of that party, and especially the particular friend of Father Hall, the leader of the most powerful section of it, and he entreated his services to bring the Jesuit and himself to some understanding and concerted action, whereby at least they might ward off some of the blows that would be aimed at them. The Archbishop said that many of the wisest politicians considered that the two parties who would divide the stage between them would be the popular party and the Papists. And if this was really the case, though he thought himself that the loyal Church party would prove stronger than was thought, it was evident that Mr. Inglesant's friend would be well able to return any kindness that the Archbishop had shown the Romanists. Inglesant went to the Jesuit as soon as possible and related his interview with the Archbishop. Father Hall listened to it with great interest. "He has been like a true ecclesiastic," he said, "blind to facts while he was in the course of his power, astonished and confounded when the natural results arrive. Nevertheless, I fancy he will make a good fight, or at least a good ending. The people know not what they want, and might have been led easily, but it is too late. What was the real amount of tyranny and persecution the people suffered? The church officers were blamed on the one hand for not putting the laws in force against the Papists, and on the other for putting them in force against the Puritans. However, he has a right view of the power of the church party, in which I join him. We shall see the good fight they will make for the king yet. The gentry and chivalry of England are rather rusty for want of use, but we shall see the metal they are made of before long. However, the Catholics will be ready first, are ready in fact now, and I have great hopes of the use that we shall make of these opportunities. I am much mistaken if such a chance as we shall have before many months are over will not be greater than we have had for a century. I shall count on you. We have been long delayed, and you must have thought all our pains would come to nothing, but we must have long patience if we enter on the road of politics. You are now, said the Jesuit, embracing the cause, full of enthusiasm and zeal, and this is very well. How else could we run out the race unless we began with some little fire? But this will not last, and unless you are warned, you may be offended and fall away. When you have lived longer in this world and outlived the enthusiastic and pleasing illusions of youth, you will find your love and pity for the race increase tenfold, your admiration and attachment to any particular party or opinion fall away altogether. You will not find the royal cause perfect any more than any other, nor those embarked in it free from mean and sordid motives, though you think now that all of them act from the noblest. This is the most important lesson that a man can learn, that all men are really alike, that all creeds and opinions are nothing but the mere result of chance and temperament, that no party is on the whole better than another, that no creed does more than shadow imperfectly forth some one side of truth, and it is only when you begin to see this that you can feel that pity for mankind, that sympathy with its disappointments and follies, and its natural human hopes, which have such a little time of growth and such a short season of decay. I have seen nothing more pathetic than touches in the life of some of these Puritans, men who have, as they thought in obedience to the will of the Deity, denied themselves pleasure, human pleasure, through their lives, and now and then some old song, some pleasant natural tale of love flashes across their path, and the true human instinct of the sons of Adam lights up within them. Nothing but the infinite pity is sufficient for the infinite pathos of human life. As you know, we have many parties in our church, nay, in our own order. Different members may be sent on opposing missions, but it is no matter, they are all alike. Hereafter it will be of little importance which of these new names, Cavalier or Roundhead, you are called by, whether you are turned Papist or Puritan, Jesuit or Jansenist, but it will matter very much whether you acted as because a man and did not flinch ignobly at the moment of trial. Choose your part from the instinct of your order, from your birth, or from habit, or what not, but having chosen it, follow it to the end. Stand by your party or your order, and especially in the hour of trial or danger, be sure you never falter. For be certain of this, that no misery can be equal to that which a man feels, who is conscious that he has proved unequal to his part, who has deserted the post his captain set him, and who, when men said, such and such a one is there on guard, there is no need to take further heed, has left his watch, or quailed before the foeman to the loss, perhaps the total ruin of the cause he had made his choice. I pray God that such misery as this may never be yours. The elections being over, London became very full. The new members hastened up, the nobility and country gentry came crowding in, and all the new houses in the Strand and Charing Cross were occupied, and a throng of young cavaliers filled the courts and precincts of the palace. As soon as the king arrived, Inglesant went into waiting in his new post, in which great responsibility in the keeping of the royal household, especially at night, devolved upon him. His post came immediately after that of the gentlemen of the privy chamber, with whom the immediate attendance on the person of the king stopped, but the charge of the king's rooms brought him continually into the royal presence. As soon as the Parliament met, the impeachment of Strafford began, and as it proceeded, the excitement grew more and more intense. It was not safe for the courtiers to go into the city except in numbers together, and a court of guard was kept by the Cavaliers before Whitehall toward Charing Cross. One day Inglesant received a letter from the Jesuit, whom he seldom saw, as follows: Jack, tell your friend the Archbishop that Lambeth House will be attacked 2 nights from this by a rabble of the populace. The Parliament leaders will not be seen in this, but they can be felt. Burn this, but let the Archbishop know the hand from which it comes. On receiving this warning, the Archbishop fortified his house and crossed the water to his chamber in Whitehall, where he slept that night and 2 others following. His house was attacked by a mob of 500 men. One of them was wounded and afterwards executed. Not much damage was done. History can furnish few events so startling and remarkable as the trial and death of Lord Strafford, events which the more they are studied, the more wondrous they appear. It is not easy to find words to express the miserable weakness and want of statesmanship which led to, and made possible, such an event. And one is almost equally surprised at the comparatively few traces of the sensation and consternation that such an event must have produced. I am not speaking of the justice or the injustice of the sentence, nor of the crime or innocence of the accused. I speak only of a great minister and servant of the crown, in whose policy and support the whole of the royal power, the whole strength of the national establishment, was involved and pledged. That such a man, by the simple clamor of popular opinion, should have been arrested, tried, and executed in a few days, with no effort but the most degrading and puny one made on his behalf by his royal master and friend, certainly must have produced a terror and excitement, one would think, unequaled in history. That the king never recovered from it is not surprising. One would have thought he would never have held up his head again. That the royal party was amazed and confounded is not wonderful. One would have thought it would have been impossible ever to have formed a royal party afterwards. That there was no power in the country able to protect either the lords or the monarch in the discharge of their conscience seems too strange to be believed. It was 2 nights after the execution. The guard was set at Whitehall, and the all-night served up. The word for the night was given, and the whole palace was considered as under the sole command of Inglesant, as the esquire in waiting. He had been round to the several gates, and seen that the courts and anterooms were quiet and clear of idlers, and then came up into the anteroom outside the privy chamber, and sat down alone before the fire. In the room beyond him were 2 gentlemen of the privy chamber, who slept in small beds drawn across the door opening into the royal bedchamber beyond. The king was in his room, in bed, but not asleep. Lord Abergavenny, the gentleman of the bedchamber in waiting, was reading Shakespeare to him before he slept. Inglesant took out a little volume of the classics, of the series printed in Holland, which it was the custom of the gentlemen of the court, and those attached to great nobles, to carry with them to read in antechambers while in waiting. The night was perfectly still, and the whole palace wrapped in a profound quiet that was almost oppressive to one who happened to be awake. Inglesant could not read. The event that had just occurred, the popular tumults, the shock of feeling which the royal party had sustained, the fear and uncertainty of the future filled his thoughts. The responsibility of his post sat on him tonight like a nightmare, and with very unusual force. A sense of approaching terror in the midst of the intense silence fascinated him, and became almost insupportable. His fancy filled his mind with images of some possible oversight and of some unseen danger which might be lurking even then in the precincts of the vast rambling palace. Gradually, however, all these images became confused, and the sense of terror dulled, and he was on the point of falling asleep when he was startled by the ringing sound of arms and the challenge of the yeoman of the guard on the landing outside the door. The next instant a voice calm and haughty, which sent a tremor through every nerve, gave back the word Christ. Inglesant started up and grasped the back of his chair in terror. Gracious heavens! Who was this that knew the word? In another moment the hangings across the door were drawn sharply back, and with a quick step, as one who went straight to where he was expected and had a right to be, the intruder entered the antechamber. It wore the form and appearance of Strafford. It was Strafford, in dress and mien and step. Taking no heed of Inglesant, crouched back in terror against the carved chimney-piece, the apparition crossed the room with a quick step, drew the hangings that screened the door of the privy chamber, and disappeared. Inglesant recovered in a moment, sprang across the room, and followed the figure through the door. He saw nothing, but the 2 gentlemen raised themselves from their couches, startled by his sudden appearance and white, scared look, and said, "What is it, Mr. Esquire?" Before Inglesant, who stood with eyes and mouth open, the picture of terror could only recover himself. The curtain of the bedchamber was drawn hastily back, and the Lord Abergavenny suddenly appeared, saying in a hurried, startled voice, "Send for Mayerne, send for Dr. Mayerne, the king is taken very ill." Inglesant, who by this time was recovered sufficiently to act, seized the opportunity to escape, and hurrying through the antechamber and down the staircase to the guard-room, he found one of the pages and dispatched him for the court and physician. He then returned to the guard at the top of the staircase. "Has anyone passed?" he asked. No, the man said. He had seen no one. "Did you challenge no one a moment ago?" The man looked scared, but finally acknowledged what he feared at first to confess, lest it should be thought he had been sleeping at his post, that he had become suddenly conscious of, as it seemed to him, some presence in the room, and found himself the next moment to his confusion challenging the empty space. Failing to make anything of the man, Inglesant returned to the privy chamber where Lord Abergavenny was relating what had occurred. "I was reading to the king," he repeated, "and his majesty was very still, and I began to think he was falling asleep, when he suddenly started upright in bed, grasped the book on my knee with one hand, and with the other pointed across the chamber to some object upon which his gaze was fixed with a wild and horror-stricken look, while he faintly tried to cry out. In a second, the terror of the sight, whatever it was, overcame him, and he fell back on the bed with a sharp cry." "Mr. Inglesant saw something," said both the gentlemen at once. "He came in here as you gave the alarm." "I saw nothing," said Inglesant. "Whatever frightened me, I must tell the king." Dr. Mayerne, who lodged in the palace, soon arrived, and as the king was sensible when he came, he merely prescribed some soothing drink and soon left. The moment he was gone, the king called Abergavenny into the room, alone to him, and questioned him as to what had occurred. Abergavenny told him all he knew, adding that the esquire-in-waiting, Mr. Inglesant, was believed to have seen something by the gentleman of the privy chamber whom he had aroused. Inglesant was sent for and found the king and Abergavenny alone. He declined to speak before the latter until the king positively commanded him to do so. Deadly pale, with his eyes on the ground, and speaking with the greatest difficulty, he then told his story of the deep silence, his restlessness, the sentry's challenge, and the apparition that appeared. Here he stopped. "And this figure," said Abergavenny in a startled whisper, "did you know who it was?" "Yes, I knew him," said the young man. "Would to God had not." "Who was it?" Paler, if possible, than before, and with a violent effort, Inglesant forced himself to look at the king. A contortion of pain, short but terrible to see, passed over the king's face, but he rose from the chair in which he sat, for he had risen from the bed and even dressed himself, and with that commanding dignity which none ever assumed better than he said, "Who was it, Mr. Esquire?" "My Lord Strafford." Abergavenny stepped back several paces and covered his face with his hands. No one spoke. Inglesant dared not stir, but remained opposite to the king, trembling in every limb, and his eyes upon the ground like a culprit. The king continued to stand with his commanding air, but stiff and rigid as a statue. It seemed as though he had strength to command his outward demeanor, but no power besides. The silence grew terrible. At last the king was able to make a slight motion with his hand. Inglesant seized the opportunity, and bowing to the ground, retired backward to the door. As he closed the door, the king turned towards Abergavenny, but the room was empty. The king was left alone. End of section 10.